Hello, welcome to Enlightning. I have a fantastic guest this week, Victor. I'm so excited to have you here. I uh welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here, so we're both excited. That's cool.
It was a funny getting to know you because the way we met is I just wanted to learn about Crossplane, and so I put a message in the Crossplane Slack saying, "Hey, does someone want to be on my show?" And you volunteered, or maybe were voluntold to do it. I don't know which. But then we both happened to be speakers in Barcelona at JDCN. So then we got to hang out in Spain for a week, which is Barcelona's where you live. So it's
Exactly.
serendipity. Yeah, that
Yes,
we
it
should
is.
hang out right now.
And
We
by the
have
way,
some
the story about you asking me saying yes, I say yes to everything. So kind of like I'm very easy to convince to do something other than real work. So
hint to everyone watching. I have the same affliction for better or worse. I'm like, so you asked me to be on your Ask Me Anything show that's coming up next. Like, we're going to do that stream right after this one. And I said yes, even though I don't, I'm a new learner and don't necessarily feel qualified, but I'm going to do it. Do my
yeah,
best.
but there is a sinister order of doing things, right? I made
Uh-huh.
sure that I'm your guest first, see how the treatment goes, and then depending on how that goes, we'll see what will happen in the next one. So because in the next one I'm taking the control, eh? So be careful.
So everyone be very kind to Victor. Ask him only really easy questions, please.
Otherwise, Whitney will be solving some extremely demanding algorithms 2 hours from now.
Also feel free to join and watch me sink or swim at that time. I want to say hi to some people in chats. Hello from India. It's so nice for you to join us. I appreciate you. And hello, Abhishek. How are you doing? Good to see you this week. And Fields neighbor, Snavel, how are you doing? Being kind, yes. I was saying beforehand, wasn't I, Victor, how kind the chat is for enlightening. Yeah. And Fuel Sable, I saw your tweet about trebuchet tiles. My son and I like to draw those sometimes. Like, we use a deck of cards for the randomization and then the four anyway. But I like trebuchet tiles. So I'm going to throw in the chat the link of where we're going to sink or swim after this. And hello to eventually, who I know to be Justin. How are you doing, Justin? So I have that link in the chat. I also, let's talk about who you are, Victor, and why we should trust you to teach us about anything.
Oh, I'm Victor. That's all you need to know.
I found this guy Victor on the street.
Exactly, kind of, and
His setup
one
looks
thing
like a
led
pro
to
setup.
another. I had to learn some, how do you call it, IT, and in the meantime, I had the week, and now I can talk about it. Yeah, that's the deal. Yeah, so yeah, my name is Victor. I work for Upbound. We're a company behind Crossplane, open source CNCF project. I like playing with stuff, so I spend most of my time exploring new things and then helping people, right? One of the things important for me is that going back to me saying yes, right? Whomever asks me for help, I give them Calendly link, and kind of I spend probably half of my time chatting with random people and trying to help out. That's what I do.
And we're on brand right now, doing the thing. You also have a pretty cool YouTube channel.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I was writing books in the past, and kind of. I was always doing something to kind of share the knowledge, share experience. That those were books and long video courses, and then I figured out that all those things were failing big time simply because I'm always trying to be on the cutting edge of technology. And then I write a book, and a year later, when I finish writing the book, I look at it kind of, why the heck did I do that? Kind of like, everything changed. I want to burn this. This is not good anymore. And same thing like video courses. a year more or less of effort, and then you finish and say, So that's why I moved into YouTube. Shorter content, it's easier to kind of be up to date.
How long have you been doing the Devops Toolkit channel?
Let me think. This September will be 2 years.
Nice,
So
nice. So I want to give a shout out to Fuel Snable, who's talking about True Shade tiles some more. If you don't know True Shade tiles, they're pretty cool.
Okay.
Yeah. And then I'm going to move to behind the board because we have a hard stop for our other show together. And Crossplane seems like it can maybe be a little complex. So I want to hurry up and get back there. But what I'm just a little, I guess, I really enjoy having you on because I'm just getting started in both like DevOps and cloud related things and also in streaming and YouTube related things. So what advice do you have for someone who's just getting started like me in both areas, I guess, in streaming and in just learning, getting caught up?
So advice what to somebody who is just starting in streaming and DevOps? Was that the question?
Yes.
No, streaming is easier to answer really because I think that people are very focused, kind of making it perfect. What camera do you have? What microphone do you have? How much you edit, redo, and stuff like that. That's just silly. Kind of like just take your iPhone, do stuff. It's going to be horrible.
A great point to be making as I carry my laptop from one place to the other. As I do this the most analog, just like lo-fi way possible. Yeah.
Yeah, because the truth is that whatever you do, you're going to look at it a few months later or a year later and say, why did I ever do it? This is horrible. And that's an excellent sign. That's great. That means that you're improving over time instead of trying to make it perfect by never doing it, right?
I heard that in the context of journaling. I like to journal every day. And it's like, if you read your past journal entries and you're not cringing, that means you're not growing. Like, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And DevOps question, that's more complicated because depending on whom you ask and with whom you speak, whether it's a company, individuals or what, DevOps is everything to everybody and nothing to somebody, and kind of nobody really knows what it is.
Mm-hmm.
So DevOps can be, hey, I know Jenkins, or DevOps can be, I'm in cloud, or it could be infrastructure as code, it could be pipelines, it could be Kubernetes, containers. So it's kind of, it became a bloated term that can mean everything and nothing to everybody and nobody type of stuff, right? But, and there is no real beginning to say start with this because it will greatly depend on what the company needs. Somebody's on-prem, somebody's cloud. Just kind of, I have a serious problem that I'm very unstructured, unorganized person. So when people ask me how do you start, I have no idea how I started, kind of like randomly, and then randomly I moved into random directions, and now I'm in Enlightning. Hey.
You made it officially.
Yeah, I made it exactly. I mean, kind of the fact that I managed to actually get into this show proves that randomness works.
I feel a little bit like that. At the beginning, I memorized the Kubernetes glossary. Once I realized that I was being pulled into a situation where I was learning publicly, so I was like, at least I'll have like the vocabulary down. And then from there, it's just like, oh, I'm curious about this. Let's check it out. Oh, I'm curious about this now. Let's check it out. And because I learned this, now I'm going to know this. And then I don't have too much structure to it either.
I think the real kind of skill or the real thing that is important to learn is actually how to connect the dots between different pieces of whatever you're doing, right? Mm-hmm. And the only way actually to start connecting the dots is by fetch a random stuff. Oh, I'm going to learn Terraform, right? Or I'm going to learn containers or Kubernetes. And then once you learn 2-3 of them, and then you start generating the picture. Okay, kind of like this in isolation was silly. But now that I learned those 3 things and I understand how they interact, now it makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm. That's great. So we have a hello to Grog DJ. Thank you.
Hey,
Thanks for
hey.
coming. And then Fuel Sneeble is dropping links about Trouche tiles. So again, check it out. They're super fun. All right. So we're going to learn about Crossplane today.
Yes.
Let's ask people in the chat, like, have you heard of Crossplane? If so, what are your impressions of Crossplane? What are you currently using Kubernetes to manage right now? What is your experience maybe with DevOps in general? Like, what kind of DevOps tools or infrastructure as code tools are you using? I would love to hear the answer to that while we get started.
Here's one very important thing, right? I work as a developer advocate, so in a way, my job is partly to evangelize, to propagate the knowledge about the existence of Crossplane. Now, if nobody says I ever heard about Crossplane, that means that I'm doing a terrible, terrible job. I need at least one person who will say, yeah, I heard about Crossplane. Then I will feel better. Or I might get a raise, even kind of like somebody from my company might be listening and say, hey, Victor, actually, thanks to you, somebody knows about Crossplane. It's my negotiating power.
Is to please lie and say you know.
Yeah, exactly. Do that. Yeah, do me a favor. Usually people say in streams like this, hey, make sure to like and subscribe. Doesn't matter. Don't forget about that. Just lie that you all heard about Crossplane from. That's the thing.
We got one Crossplane is awesome going on.
There we go.
Yeah.
Grant, I want bump in salary. This is now message for my management.
All right. Oh, then here we have one from Komarjum. Heard about Crossplane. I work on EKS and kubeadm and Ceph storage. That's
awesome.
Great. Yeah,
absolutely
thank you
awesome.
for that. So to have the context to learn about Crossplane and how it works, where should we start?
Let's start with Kubernetes. Let's talk about Kubernetes. What is Kubernetes. Kind of, we have a cluster, right?
Okay.
And inside of that cluster, majority of people, right? When I ask about people, hey, what is Kubernetes? They would say two things. First, they will say, Kubernetes is all about running containers in my cluster. So you end up having that box, which you will regret for drawing it too small.
I can erase.
Yeah, it's okay. So in that box, you have containers, right? And those containers are packaged as pods, and they are created through different abstractions. But ultimately, you have containers, right?
Okay. So these are our workers.
Exactly, worker nodes.
Okay.
I'm not going now into details how Kubernetes works, but more kind of from a user perspective. You have pods and they have containers, and that's great. Now, and then people say, hey, Kubernetes is all about helping me running containers. And that's kind of true. But then when you create those containers as pods, deployments, replica sets, you're most likely going to create ingress, for example, right?
Okay.
And if you create ingress inside of that those nodes, that ingress will create an external load balancer, right? That is nothing to do with your cluster outside.
No, there's an ingress is inside the cluster.
The ingress is, but ingress creates a load balancer that is outside.
Okay.
It manages your infrastructure that is not really containers anymore. It manages infrastructure outside. Or the same thing, like your applications might need storage, and then you will create a persistent volume claim, which will go to whatever your provider, API of your provider is, and say, hey, give me a disk drive. Right? And that's already giving a hint how Kubernetes is actually not only about containers, it is managing your infrastructure, even though it's not that obvious, because load balancers are infrastructure outside of the cluster, and disk drives storage is also outside.
So I'm drawing things as you say them. I'm not sure if I'm doing it accurately. Is this
You're doing
relatively
yeah.
accurately? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, kind of,
And
it
so,
would be accurate. So in those worker nodes, you would deploy Ingress, and Ingress would create that load balancer, right? So you instruct Kubernetes, say, hey, Kubernetes, I want this, and it's Kubernetes' job to figure out how to create that something, whatever that something is. And the point I'm trying to make is that it's not only about containers. Or let me think about something else. You can tell Kubernetes, hey, create a virtual machine using kubevirt, right? So not only containers. Kubernetes today is managing potentially almost anything. And the way how it is doing that is by you extending Kubernetes by installing additional custom resource definitions. So you can say, hey, let's say theoretically, right? I could create a custom resource definition in my Kubernetes cluster that would be managing this stream, right? Muting Victor whenever he says something silly. Right? That's a perfectly...
We never hear you.
That's a perfectly legitimate, could be legit use of custom resource definitions. The point is that, and then what I believe confuses people is that people think that Kubernetes by itself is something that you use, but that's not true, because that base, that Kubernetes that you just install, it's almost useless by itself, right? The ingress that I was mentioning, that ingress does not come out of the box in Kubernetes. You need to install the controller in your control plane.
Okay.
And to say, hey, from now on, I want to extend Kubernetes to manage external traffic, create load balancers, manage whatever that is. Same thing goes for storage. It's not baked into Kubernetes. You need to extend it.
Okay.
So in a way, you are using Kubernetes to you're actually not using Kubernetes as is. You're fine-tuning Kubernetes depending on your needs, whatever your needs are, because they're going to be different, whether you're in on-prem, VMware, or Azure, or AWS, whatever you're using, right? Now, what we are trying, and actually before I get into what we are trying to do, so you can think of Kubernetes. I think that actually the word that you brought over there, control plane, I think in my head that's the key word, right? Kubernetes is not about something running something. It's about something controlling resources. And those resources can be anything. Now, what we are trying to do with Crossplane is give people those custom resources that they can just install to use Kubernetes to manage something. And that something can be, really depends on what contributions people put to the project, right? Anything in AWS, in Azure, in Google, potentially, I don't know, GitHub repositories, anything. Basically, our goal is to give means to people when they install Crossplane in their cluster, they install providers, and those providers are managing things. And in that sense, some people might actually say, hey, it's similar to Terraform or Ansible or Pulumi or other.
I don't understand what you mean by installing providers. You're installing providers into your Kubernetes cluster?
So think of it this way. In your Kubernetes cluster. So think of it this way. Crossplane is an engine that by itself doesn't do much.
Okay.
And then when you install a provider, let's say AWS provider for the sake of argument, that provider will install approximately 800 custom resource definitions.
So so when you install an AWS provider, is that a Crossplane abstraction, or is that an AWS thing?
It's a Crossplane way of instructing Crossplane of the existence, in this example, of all the resources in AWS. So you
Got
get
it.
you get a resource in Kubernetes called, let's say, EC2, right? And then you can say create EC2 instance, and then Crossplane goes to AWS and does whatever needs to be done for that something to run.
Okay.
So basically, providers are a set of resources that are matching the real resources that you're managing, like
Yes.
or a Kubernetes cluster or a node pool, and so on
So
and so forth.
can I say a provider is a cross-plane abstraction? I understand it's bundled. It's a set of abstractions.
Yeah, it's a set.
Maybe that's the way to say it.
It's a set of abstractions, or Kubernetes, more than abstractions, the extensions of Kubernetes API to have more resources you can manage. Like you can say, if you want to manage a pod in Kubernetes, you have a schema for that pod, and you say, hey, I define something by that schema, and I get a pod. We are doing the same, just that we are extending what the types of resources Kubernetes has to be able to manage additional stuff.
So we have
providers are kind of like a bundle of Kubernetes extensions to manage something, and that can be one resource in that bundle, in that provider, or it can be 800 like in AWS.
Okay, so Grog DJ says it's a provider, a bridge between a cloud provider and Crossplane, but also they say it's a bridge between a cloud provider and Kubernetes. So is it a bridge between all three things?
So it's a bridge between, a provider is a bridge between Kubernetes and cloud provider, let's say, right?
Okay.
So it is instructions recipe, let's say recipe, that becomes available in Kubernetes that you can use to cook something, right? Recipe, how do I manage something somewhere?
And then you said AWS has 800 of them?
Yes, AWS has, don't take it for granted, the exact number, but give or take 800 type of resources. And it's the only correction I would say to that is that it is most commonly a bridge between Kubernetes and a cloud provider, but not necessarily cloud provider, right? You can instruct, you can have a recipe, a provider, a group of resources to manage on-prem something, right? Whatever that something is. Or it can be to manage something completely different. Like I saw a provider, I think, for ordering pizzas from Domino's. It's not cloud, right?
I can use Crossplane to order pizza from Domino's. Is that what you just said?
Yeah, exactly. So it's whomever is designing those providers can choose what that something is, right? So not necessarily always cloud.
Okay, I'd like to check in from the chat. Is everyone following? I think these are all concepts we've talked about in past episodes, but I just want to make sure everyone's with us because we just jumped really kind of deep in it, which I enjoy, but I want to make sure, see if there's any questions. We have a comment from Kumar. Crossplane reads the AWS secrets from the host or Kubernetes secret if we're installing an AWS provider.
Yes, so you install AWS provider that gives you capability to manage AWS resources. And then you can give that provider one or more configurations that give it means to authenticate against, in this case, AWS. And that's done through Kubernetes secrets. Excellent.
And we have Grog saying in some way the CRDs from a provider maps to the cloud provider APIs. That makes a lot of sense to me.
Exactly. It's not exactly one-to-one mapping, but for the sake of argument, you can see that you can say that it's a translation of provider's API into Kubernetes API.
I like that. And I want to say hello to Fendel real quick. Hi, Fendel. Thanks for coming. I appreciate you. Kumar says, among the AWS provider, I want only 20 resources to manage. Can we do that?
Yeah, so you cannot, at least not
question.
today, not install
the whole thing.
provider. Yes. Now, you could create a new provider and say, hey, my provider has only 20 AWS resources, right? Or you can just say, I'm not going to use the 780 resources that I don't need. I mean, nobody needs 800 resources, right?
Is that actually, that's not actually taking up any space in your cluster, is it? Or is it a running resource, or is it more like a definition that you can pull in if you need?
Space, no. So it is consuming a bit of memory and CPU from the control plane. Because for Kubernetes now, that is, until before Crossplane Kubernetes, your Kubernetes cluster knew about maybe 50 different resource types. And now we're jumping it to 1,000 or 2,000, right? So it does use a bit of more memory and CPU. We are working constantly to reduce that by contributing to Kubernetes, but yeah, it is using some resources.
Okay. And then we have another question. Can we manage OpenShift, Rancher, Tanzu, Nomad?
So I cannot answer that question. And the reason why I cannot answer is because it's an open source community-led project. It's in CNCF, right? So I don't have any inside information about every provider everybody ever made, right? Some providers are contributed back. Some providers are just stay within the organization that created those providers, and so on and so forth. So I cannot say for certain. But what I can say is that if there is no provider for OpenShift or Rancher or Tanzu or Nomad, one can be created. That's the spirit of open source, exactly. And community is very welcoming. If anybody wants to help out, contribute with additional providers, you will be very, very welcomed. Excellent. I will send you, if you want to contribute, I never check this with marketing, so I might be saying something I shouldn't. I send first 5 contributors a swag package.
Oh, nice.
As
I like that.
compensation.
Kelsey,
question. I'm sorry. I don't know whether I put you into a mess now.
It's tantalizing just knowing if you might be doing something wrong. Can we manage a V cluster with Crossplane? I imagine your answer is similar to the last one.
No, it is definitely yes. So
there is no V cluster. Cool.
I haven't seen V cluster provider in C per se, but there is, among others, there is a Kubernetes provider that allows you to manage any existing Kubernetes resources, and V cluster actually can be managed through that provider. And then Mauricio, which is joining us on the next stream.
Yes.
We chatted yesterday, the day before yesterday, about him creating vCluster. So whomever asked that question, put pressure on Mauricio. You will see him soon.
Salaboy on Twitter. Yeah,
Salaboy, exactly.
Go pressure. Chase him. So I want to take a minute and back up because I feel like we just jumped so quickly into the weeds. So I want to I don't even think we have like a very clear definition of what Crossplane is yet, and we're already talking about like what it should manage. So we have our Kubernetes cluster, our worker. We know that we can manage pods and applications. That's a pretty familiar use. And then also you're saying that you may not be paying attention, but we're managing some resources with Kubernetes outside of the cluster. For example, load balancer and PVC, those are pretty regular things that people manage with Kubernetes. So now Crossplane seems, I can feel you going in a direction where Crossplane is going to help us manage other types of resources that exist outside of the Kubernetes cluster, like the 800 ones that AWS interacts with, or vCluster, for example. Yeah.
So let's put it this way. Let's say that, would it be too offensive if I tell you draw this?
Not at all. I would love it even.
Okay. So we have Crossplane in our Kubernetes cluster there, where you have workload running.
So Crossplane is a workload. It's not on the control plane. It's on our worker
No,
nodes as a
it's a
workload.
workload. Yeah, I mean it is extending control plane, but when you install it on a workload, and it is itself is going to extend the control plane. But you run it in a workload, right? So you have Crossplane over there.
So this is Crossplane.
Exactly.
This is where I didn't leave enough room at all.
We're getting there.
I just thought Crossplane was going to be on the control plane. I just guessed incorrectly.
Yeah, it is actually extending Crossplane, but control plane. So its job is actually to communicate with control plane and tell control plane, hey, from now on, Crossplane goes to control plane and says, from now on, whenever somebody wants to interact with AWS, this is how you do it, right? So it is extending control plane. Now, let's say that we install providers for AWS, whatever. Let's say that that's all part of the Crossplane bundle, right? Now, imagine you're a human over there. Draw a tiny person, right? Somewhere. There we go. Exactly. Don't put a large nose because that would be me then. Okay, cool. So you tell Kubernetes from there on saying, hey, I would like to create, what should we do? Let's say an EKS cluster in AWS. You go there and you
And I'm doing that through kubectl?
Yes, kubectl. Okay. Exactly. You're doing kubectl and saying, kubectl, create an EKS cluster. That's not a literally command, but basically that's what you're saying, right? Actually, scratch that. No.
Okay.
I want to have, not create, I want to have a Kubernetes cluster. I think that's very important word. Because you're not...
So I have one, but I also want another one.
No. I want a Kubernetes cluster. Now,
that's all
whether you need to create it or update it or what you need to do with it is a separate story, right? So, kubectl, I want a cluster.
Okay. I want a cluster.
Exactly.
Okay.
You send that information to Kubernetes API, and since that is a specific type of resource, like let's call it EKS kind, Crossplane will intercept that desire.
So it's going here.
Exactly.
Okay, got it. And this is how controllers work generally.
Exactly.
Is that they can intercept, right?
From there on, you would have in your Kubernetes cluster, let's say EKS resource.
So
just like you have pod, right? There we go. Exactly. And Crossplane will intercept that and say, oh, okay, so you want a Kubernetes cluster in AWS. I should go to AWS. This is the moment where you draw AWS.
Yeah. Okay.
It's okay to say that I'm confusing everybody because I do that often. There we go.
I'm with you so far. I'm more just thinking about space and drawing. Yeah.
Yeah, you won't have enough.
Yeah.
I guarantee you that.
So Crossplane, the controller, talks to Crossplane, the workload, that talks to AWS.
Yeah, to the API of AWS. Yes. And AWS will create that something, let's say EKS cluster. That's a real physical thing, right? Now, from there on, and then you can, as a person, you can use the cluster any way you like. Now, what will happen, and this is what makes a difference between Crossplane and many other tools, is that it is not only going to do something when you tell it to do. From there on, Crossplane, through the instructions you passed with kubectl, will be constantly monitoring that cluster and making sure that it's always okay. Kind of whatever happens to it, if the definition, the specification that you defined in Kubernetes and what it really is starts to diverge, Crossplane will correct that something. So let's say that you have a cluster with 3 nodes, and one of that nodes goes down because something happens, right? Crossplane will detect, hey, you said 3, there are 2. I should do something about it. I should create the 3rd node. That's very similar to what we do in Kubernetes with other stuff. Like if you create a deployment with a replica set that creates 3 pods, 3 containers, Kubernetes will always make sure that there are always 3 containers, 3 pods, not 5, not 4, not 2, right? So it is, think of it as some kind of a constant loop where Crossplane is constantly making sure that it is what it should be.
If I draw down, it's going to cover my own face. So I'm hearing you, and I'm not speaking much because I'm thinking about how to capture this.
Sure. And tell me when I should slow down or speed up. Both options are okay.
How are we doing in the chat? Are people following, and do they have any questions?
Let's see. And drift detection for free. Exactly.
Well, yeah.
And Bifrost. And so any command the user wants to issue to that new cluster is done through one of those CRDs provided by Crossplane too. Not necessarily command, but any definition of the desired state, right? So, and I think that that's a fundamental difference between Kubernetes in general and how we were doing things before. You don't say create this, you say this is what I want. It's your job. So we're not issuing really commands. We are issuing the state we want something to be in. You're too tall for your own good.
I know, right? So,
and
creates resources. Okay.
Yes, creates resources.
Abhishek, thanks for confirming.
Oh, yeah. So creates, updates, deletes. It does different operations on resources to ensure that what you want is always what it is.
Maintains desired state.
Correct. Maintains the actual state to be the same as the desired state. So there is no need to maintain the desired state. It's making sure that the actual state, what something really is exactly the same as the desired state. Exactly.
Excellent. So I think it would please me to have to write out a definition of what Crossplane is. I think we understand what it's doing, but can we capture it in like a sentence that we can refer back to as we go?
Oh, if you find it out, can you tell me as well? I'd like to know.
So Crossplane itself is a controller that helps you create controllers that will watch over different parts of your infrastructure to make sure not only is the actual state, the desired state and workloads like you're used to thinking about Kubernetes, but actually can be desired state as in your infrastructure too, managing all kinds of resources outside of.
Exactly. So it's a way to use, and I'm now trying to define only the parts that I described so far. There's more.
Okay.
So kind of, so far, think of Crossplane as a way to extend Kubernetes so that you can manage infrastructure or other types of resources using Kubernetes with all the benefits that Kubernetes gives, like drift detection, reconciliation, which for those not familiar, drift detection reconciliation is essentially what I was mentioning before, that says I'm constantly watching over those resources and making sure that they're always fine. Think of it as full-time nanny, kind of like watching over your child, kind of like, hey, 24/7.
To manage external resources, and so we want to say with all the bells and whistles that Kubernetes offers.
With all the good stuff with Kubernetes, everybody's used with Kubernetes.
All the good Kubernetes stuff. I guess that's our definition so far.
Yes, you will notice that I like to use the word stuff all the time.
We have some comments.
I was about to say the same. Yep.
Great. I'll let you lead.
So, to begin with, before I go into differences between Cluster API and Crossplane, there are similarities in terms that both Cluster API and Crossplane are trying to convert Kubernetes control plane into extending Kubernetes control plane to manage more than just containers inside of that cluster, right? So that's a similarity, and I'm 100% sure that that's the direction we will be going. That's the direction of Kubernetes from the very start. Extend it to convert it into control plane to manage whatever the stuff is. Now, the differences between the two, and I'm ignoring syntax differences, like, oh, you write this type of YAML and that type of YAML. But
Great.
Cluster API, Cluster API is focused on how can we manage Kubernetes clusters from a Kubernetes cluster, so kind of inception, and that's about it, right? So it's focused on Kubernetes clusters in different providers, like EKS example that I gave. Crossplane has slightly bigger scope. How can you manage everything in AWS? And I'm using AWS as an example. So if you would be using Cluster API with AWS, you would be able to use it to manage EKS cluster, period. That's all it does. Crossplane tries to be wider. How can you manage anything in AWS, not only Kubernetes clusters? So think of it as Kubernetes version of Terraform-like infrastructure as code type of tool with additional benefits. The benefits are all the things you like in Kubernetes. Those are the benefits.
So if you need a Kubernetes cluster to create Kubernetes cluster, is it necessary to have a management cluster that's just a totally separate thing from anything you create? And
yes.
If so, okay. And then what's a common way to do that? Is that usually something run locally, or do you create one manually at the AWS and then use that to manage everything else?
Yes, so you need to have that, and this is similar to Cluster API question from before. You need to have that initial management cluster, which can be Docker desktop, Minikube on your laptop, right?
Okay.
Any type of, whatever is easiest way for you to create a Kubernetes cluster, install Crossplane and say, now manage this, right? You can even move it later on after the initial installation done on your laptop. You can move it and say, now that you're managing this cluster, how about you move yourself over there and continue managing yourself?
That makes sense. I think maybe I'm unfamiliar with what I don't know the term cluster API. I guess I thought maybe that was like a Kubernetes API, but that's something else. It's like
no. That's
AWS's API or GCP's API. That's a cluster API.
Cluster API is a separate project, just like Crossplane, that does also extends Kubernetes and allows you to use Kubernetes to manage other Kubernetes clusters somewhere, wherever that somewhere is. So it's very similar to what I said so far about Crossplane, except that Cluster API manages Kubernetes clusters, while Crossplane manages potentially everything. The scope is. So if you need a database, let's say the same diagram that I say, kubectl, I want a database. Then Crossplane would create a database and manage the database for you from there on. While Cluster API is limited to managing only other Kubernetes clusters.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that for me. I thought I would like to hear some examples. You just said a database of other resources that Crossplane can manage. So database,
storage,
probably SaaS stuff, maybe?
SaaS, yeah, exactly. You could use to manage, I'm not now 100% sure whether there is already a provider, but let's say Datadog service, right?
Yeah.
Or SaaS, yes. And what else? Basically anything, right? My brain stopped now. Other Kubernetes clusters, of course.
Let's
Lambdas.
Lambdas. LA. There's a B in there, right?
I'm just random examples, right? So think about it. I picked 3 out of 800 examples only in AWS.
And image registries?
Again, I cannot confirm because I'm not aware of all the providers, but for the sake of argument, let's say yes. Kind of now. So the limit is only how many providers we as collectively community industry creates. But essentially now it's very, the goal is very big. Basically, we want to extend Kubernetes to manage literally anything. Ultimate goal being domino pizzas, right? So anything is a fair game. The only limitation is how many resources were added to providers so far. And I think that as of this date, and I'm going to throw a random figure, I think that around 3, maybe more thousand resources are currently being managed by Crossplane in different places, different providers or SaaSes or.
So I want to acknowledge some chat. When we were defining down here, Bifrost said an orchestrator of orchestrators.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I use the term control plane of control planes.
Yeah.
But orchestrator of orchestrators is just as good.
And
that's a good one. What Crossplane entity is doing in control plane and worker nodes? How does it work? So in control plane is where you would keep all the custom resource definitions that define how you define, database storage, SaaS, lambdas, image registries. So in control plane, we extend it through by adding more and more and more custom resource definitions. And in worker nodes are controllers. Controllers are those that interpret what you say that you want through those custom resources and do something. Controllers are, think of them as Santa's little helpers, right? They're actually doing the actual work. They're intercepting. When you say, I want a database, controller is the one that listens to the API and says, okay, so this is my job. Kind of like I'm controller number 3 in charge of everything AWS, for example. I got this, kind of like, I'll take care of it. And goes to the AWS API and does whatever needs to be done.
So the controllers are all defined on the control plane, but then the actual workloads are running on
so kind of definitions are in control plane, but controllers themselves, they're containers, and containers in most cases tend to run in worker nodes.
That makes sense. We have some. Kumar said GitHub repos when we were listing these things, which kind of leads us to how does GitOps play into all of this question?
Oh, good questions. Yes.
Okay.
So, So I tend to say that using standard tooling, and if you add that standard tooling like Argo CD or Flux or whatever else you're doing for GitOps, you're effectively managing applications running in your Kubernetes clusters based on GitOps principles. That's what you're doing. Now, if you and the important thing here is that all GitOps tools are designed, all those Vert using are designed to be Kubernetes native. They're running Kubernetes. They understand only Kubernetes, nothing else. So GitOps is for applications, unless, because they're limited by Kubernetes. But if you extend Kubernetes and say, okay, now this Kubernetes cluster can manage more than only applications, then effectively you're converting GitOps from being limited to applications in Kubernetes clusters, not even all applications, into everything. So kind of like Argo CD or Flux plus Kubernetes, that's GitOps for applications. Argo CD or Flux plus Kubernetes plus Crossplane is GitOps. And this is going to sound very pompous. GitOps for everything.
And everything. So here's this. I'm following. I understand. This all seems very exciting and like a pretty revolutionary, maybe. But it does seem really complicated to set up or to like. Can you talk to that?
Okay, and now I'm gonna come to the part and say, all the flow that I was describing is something that almost nobody uses.
This flow here.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And let me explain why.
Okay.
So to create, and I'm going to continue using AWS if that's okay. Just kind of keep the same example, right?
Okay.
To create a cluster in AWS, you need to create, and count with me, EKS, node group, internet gateway, a bunch of subnets, a bunch of VPCs, or at least one or more VPCs,
okay.
And probably at least 10 other resources that my gateway, I don't know, I mentioned. Anyways, you need to create a bunch of things, right? Because all those cloud providers, they're building blocks. And that's good because they allow you to do stuff. But effectively, if I would translate everything I need for Kubernetes clustering in AWS into YAML or any other language, doesn't matter, I would probably reach a couple of thousand lines of something, of a definition. Now, what's kind of like 1% in a company understands all that nonsense, madness? So it's very, very hard because you need thousands and thousands of lines of any language, any tool, doesn't matter. Now, that's why we have something called compositions.
Okay.
And compositions are actually, now I'm getting to what people are really using. So think of it this way. Let's say that we do role playing. We have two personas.
Okay.
Ops person who understands AWS inside out. Kind of like, that's he when he goes to sleep, he dreams
or
AWS. Or she. Yes, exactly. Let's say we will have him and her. She is the operator. She dreams AWS.
Okay.
And then we have 99% of a company who does something else. Front-end developer, back-end developer, operator for something else. You know, we have all type of expertise in a company. Now, we have two ways how those two different personas can work together. One is I'm going to open a Jira ticket in which I'm going to say, I need this. And then I'm going to wait indefinite amount of time until my request comes into the queue because you're the only one who knows how to do that. Alternative to that is to what I would say shift left and say, she, the AWS dreaming operator, she will actually create a service that others can consume and say, okay, so we have those thousands and thousands of lines of something and tens of resources, but what does it matter for you? What do you need to be successful with your cluster, right? And that person would say, hey, I want to know whether the cluster is big or small. I want to decide whether it's running in US or Europe, you know, couple of things. And then me as a operator, actually it's a girl, you as an operator, you would create a service that would make that easier with 5 lines of YAML, or maybe a button with some form or something, and say, from now on, don't bother me. I have more important things to do. Whenever you need whenever you need cluster, you just fill in those fields, click a button.
This request that I'm receiving from you is a request I feel often. I get this request all the time, every time anyone, like any developer, needs to work on something new.
Exactly.
So I'm finding a way to automate that request.
Exactly. By enabling others to do it themselves, but by removing the complexity that is irrelevant to that somebody else, right? Because nobody cares about subnets. Kind of like, who cares about subnets? Only you care about subnets. Exactly. You're the only one who cares about that, right? So, but we need to have them. And that's where Crossplane compositions, which you already draw, come into play, right? They're a way for, so if Crossplane providers give you new types of resources in Kubernetes, like EC2 instance, compositions are a way for you as a person to define new resources and say, clusters, and you can create a new instance, say, witness clusters.
Okay.
Right? It's completely new. Doesn't come out of the box from Crossplane or anything. You are defining what that something is. And I see you don't like my name for the resource fitting clusters, huh? Okay, well, I'll remember that for the AMA. Okay. I'm kidding.
What I do, I don't even know. So you're defining your own resources from the building blocks that the providers, the Crossplane providers.
Exactly. Yeah. So you say, one example that I often use is say, hey, cluster means EKS cluster and a node group and VPCs and subnets and gateways and what's not. And not only that, but that cluster, when it's created, needs to have Prometheus installed inside of that cluster. It needs to be made production ready. So it's not the only AWS. There's a lot of work required to have a production ready cluster. Some of that work related to AWS, and I'm using AWS just as an example. Some of the work inside of that cluster. Maybe I'm going to for that cluster, create a repository so that I can continue pushing stuff into that cluster through GitOps, right? So think of it like, this is what I need to do to have a successful cluster, but you only care about this, right? And I'm going to expose this to you, like 10 lines of YAML, and I'm going to define, as a person who creates that composition, whenever you write those 10 lines of YAML with some parameters, I'm going to do all those things. So the difference is that all of a sudden now, you're not extending Kubernetes through some resources created by somebody else. You are in control to define what you want to have in that cluster.
Is this what people call a supply chain?
No, the supply chain would be more like, in a way, a pipeline, do this and do that and stuff like that. Okay. This is more like we're going to create something new in this Kubernetes cluster. We're going to define some new type of resource. And whenever somebody says, let's say that resource is going to be called Victor. And Victor is very easy to define because he's simpleton as a person. We can define Victor with only 3 parameters. But whenever we define him with only 3 parameters, it's going to explode into all the subnets, VPCs, and Prometheus is going to be installed. So it's a way to define an interface for others and what that interface will do. So that it provides a very clear separation of concerns. I, as operator, I know how to, and I know all the things that we mentioned, like subnets, VPCs, what's or not. And I'm going to hide 99% of that, or 98, or 50%, whatever, depends on who my customers are, and my customers are developers, or testers, or whatever the role is.
Okay, so do you think I captured the complexity of what you said here? So, as an operator, a way to define your own resources from the building blocks that the Crossplane providers package gives you. And then you expose knobs to give others in the org the power to create their own instances with a simplified interface that you create.
Exactly.
Okay, cool.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
so it's simplifying the complexity so that others can become your users.
Oh, I played right into it when I was like, oh, this feels complicated.
So
wow.
good example would be, let's say that now you and me go to Amazon to do some shopping, right?
Okay.
Now, neither of us understands the complexity of shipping, right? All I do is same day delivery. I don't care.
Magic.
Kind of like those are the options that you are given because they spoke with a lot of users and say, what do you care when you're shipping? Kind of like, what are the things that matter to you? We are going to expose them, but it's much more complex behind the scenes, right? Really, what needs to happen for you to receive your stuff to your doorstep is much more complex than clicking a button.
Yes.
But it's something similar with compositions. Speak with developers. What do you need to be successful? You create an interface for them, and then the complexities behind that. You instruct Kubernetes what to do.
I have more questions, but I feel like I'm maybe being a little selfish and the chat's popping off. So I'm going to give the chat some love, and then I'll ask mine. Fuel Snable says, I understand true shape patterns, but whenever people say control plane or abstractions, I get lost. If you have a more specific question, I would love to bring you with us, Fuel Snable.
Yeah.
Fuel Snable is
one question for him. If you can teach me what is Truchet, or her, sorry.
He's a he, but I just don't want to
okay. Sorry for that. Not intentional. If you can teach me what Truchet is, I would be very grateful.
Yeah. I think they did drop a link up top, but yeah.
Okay.
It's a way to make a pattern with a tile, like Truchet tiles. Okay. Sorry, I skipped forward. So Kumar has something to say about my diagram. In the diagram, why not have a controller in the control plane node, like the Kubernetes controller manager?
I mean, you could have controller in the control plane node. It really depends on whether, because controller ultimately is a pod because there is a code running that does something. Now, depends all where your cluster is running, right? You will not be able, if you go to cloud, manage Kubernetes cluster, you will not be able to run any pod in control plane other than those that are already there, right? So you can, if you have a control over control plane.
Excellent. And then Fuel Snable says, I sometimes miss software of the 90s, targeting a single machine with a single CPU with a single thread. Isn't that like something a developer would say, and maybe ops people don't miss that at all when they have to try to keep all their environments all the same?
I mean, I think that everybody is missing, at least those who did work in 90s. We're all missing that kind of simplicity, right? But our objectives changed, right? In 90s, if I had 5 users, I was happy. Now, if I have anything less than 5 million, kind of, business is going really bad, right? So situation changed. The goals changed. But I miss also simplicity. I think that, now, for the record, I think that we are still, it doesn't sound like that in very early stages of Kubernetes. I think the simplicity is coming. We are building those layers on top of Kubernetes. But you would need to invite me a couple of years in a couple of years to talk about it. I think that we're not there yet.
And then the question, as that happens, is there still someone who needs to understand everything from top to bottom, or do we get abstracted away from even ourselves?
Somebody should know. It's hard to answer because it depends how much work you delegate to others, right?
Yeah.
So you might say, hey, no, this company, whatever the company is going to manage this for me, and then you don't necessarily need to understand in detail until the level that they're managing for you. But let's say that you're not using services of managed services from others, then yes, somebody needs to know about that. Yeah. And by the way, going back to the 90s thing, compositions are actually trying to put you back into 90s in a way with simplicity, right? Because for the users of a composition, it's extremely simple. I want a cluster, I want it to be big, and I want it to be in US, period. As easy as it was in the 90s. It's just that still somebody, the real work, the real complexity is still there. So the author, the designer of that composition needs to think about that complexity. But we are trying to hide it from the rest of the world in a way. So
and that's
somebody can go back to 90s.
That's actually even my question about compositions. In my very limited experience, it reminds me of when I've used Helm charts with the UI. So I only see certain things that I need to change. How is this different from that? Oh, it has a controller, so it's always checking the state.
So the difference is that with Helm charts, things are happening on client side. The complexity is still there on your computer. Whether you look at it or no, it's a different thing, right? Mm-hmm. It's not discoverable. You cannot easily know what it is, and so on and so forth. So, but what can be compared is, think about. So if you have a Helm chart, you have typically values file that most of the people edit, and then templates directory, which is the madness, right? And most people do not go into templates. That's whomever designed that Helm chart, he understands it. Everybody else just modifies simply a values file. Now think about it. Yep.
We have some developers in the stream, so I briefly want to define what a Helm chart is.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, okay, so me? Yeah, so a Helm chart is a way to convert Kubernetes YAML files into templates so that they can be customized, right? You say, hey, this is YAML, 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 and then the value here should not be hard-coded into that YAML, but it should be templated so that when I change the value somewhere else, it's automatically applied. So it's a templating engine.
And you can bundle a lot of Kubernetes resources together into one Helm chart that are meant to run together, so you don't have to consider them separately. Yeah.
That's that templates that I mentioned that is complex, that can have one YAML or one resource defined or 100 resources. It can be anything between 10 lines and infinity, right? But you as a user of that Helm chart, you do not really, very often do not care about all that. What is in templates directory, you care about values file, which is relatively simple. Kind of, the domain, the address is this, the size is XYZ, and so on and so forth. So now, when you think about compositions, think about the complex part, the templates being moved to the cluster. And you're left only with the things that matter, which is that values file for you. And that being discoverable, because you can always go to Kubernetes and say, okay, so what is the schema? How do I define this? It is not only values file, it's a full-blown Kubernetes resource, like any other Kubernetes resource, except that it was designed for you to use it. So think of it as, I designed Kubernetes in a way that is appropriate for your needs.
Okay. I like that. I have more questions, but I want to acknowledge everybody in chat who's participating too.
Yeah, let's do that.
So this is providing some form of predefined template for self-selection. I want to create a cluster based on templates 1, 2, 3. So
yes,
is that accurate?
Yeah, that's. I mean, now I could go crazy and say how simple that is, and then we go insane. But yes, in an essence, it is. Clusters, templates, but defined in a cluster.
Templates, but defined in the cluster. Then we have, how it's this infrastructure complexity creation made easy with compositions. How does it manage, or what does it look like in a Kubernetes environment?
So it depends on the persona. So if you create the composition called Victor, right? You can and the schema is whatever it is. You can say, hey, give me all the Victors, and it would give you all the instances of Victor, right? Now you can also go deep and say, what are all the child resources of Victor, and then you would get subnets, VPCs, and all those things. So it provides that division that, hey, if you really want to know about this specific resource like Victor, which is a composition, you can just deal with that. You can query Kubernetes, you can update, delete, do whatever you want with it. Or child resources, those that were created. Now, when I talk about it, sounds so weird. Created from Victor. From that composition.
Genghis Khan, yeah. So you could use kubectl or anything that you would normally use to query or observe.
Yeah, kubectl. You can use Helm. You can define it because it's a Kubernetes resource. Like you're extending Kubernetes with additional resources, and this is now I think the beauty of it is. Kubernetes ecosystem is probably the biggest ecosystem we ever knew as industry, right? Kind of only if you go to CNCF landscape, you get a mild heart attack because how overwhelming it is, right? So and by being Kubernetes native means that you can plug that and combine it with whatever you normally use in Kubernetes. You want admission controllers to apply policies to resources managed by Crossplane. Yeah, you can do that. You want logs to be shipped somewhere because that's what you do. You can do that. Metrics with Prometheus, you can do that. So the strength is the ecosystem, kind of probably what all the toolings that people were listening in previous episodes, not necessarily all, but many of the tools of Enlightning that are designed to work inside Kubernetes, they're all interoperable, right?
We're doing Argo CD next week, which I know is one that you like with Crossplane.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So,
but yeah,
it's extremely important that it's Kubernetes native so that you can do all the stuff that you normally do.
That's cool. Cypheric says hi. By the way, great discussion stream. Thank you. Hello. Lambda and serverless is how would they think of when they think of the 90s?
Yes. So there is I'll keep this because this is actually the topic we're starting in 45 minutes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, we're going to talk about serverless on Victor's stream in 45 minutes. Yeah, set your timers. Grog DJ says Helm templates, the madness that deserves a t-shirt.
Don't say it twice. I work on impulse. I'll do it.
Phil Stable says, what about the node ecosystem? That seems pretty big to me.
I'm not sure I understood the question. So
yeah, do you mean node as in a Kubernetes machine, or do you mean Node.js? Oh, Napalm's here. Hi, Napalm. Welcome.
Hey.
Tell us more about your question, Fuel Snable. And I think you kind of answered mine when you were talking about Kubernetes extensions. My question was about the Crossplane compositions. When people get really excited about how much gets abstracted away, then my next question is almost always like, well, then how do you debug if things are so become opaque to you?
So they're they're not hidden. They're just put one layer down, right? So you can, if you have that hypothetical resource Victor, right? You can say, give me all the information about Victor, or you can say Victor and children, right? So all that complexity is a parent-child relationship. So you can track it down and go down the stream and say, oh, so Victor created this and this created that, and so on and so forth.
So
you can
all
easily
the
track it
tools
down.
You would use to have insight and debug of any Kubernetes resource, you would also use them here.
Yes. Exactly.
And it seems like Node.js is, so Fuel Snable it's more of a comment when you said Kubernetes has the biggest ecosystem, like maybe Node.js also has all the npm packages.
I don't want to argue, but it's bigger.
Debug is so 1990s. Yeah, no debugging, just kill it and make it again. Oh, and there's Grog DJ is saying Kubernetes is way bigger than Node.js.
It is.
And feel stable. Yeah. Cool. So I still have a little room on the board, and I feel like, do you have more you want to say? For one thing, you said this definition is the definition so far. Like you're going to have more to add because we want to add about compositions.
That last line would be the definition. Then the second would be Crossplane compositions allow you to. I don't know. Is it too confusing if I say to shift left?
I don't know. What does the chat think? I kind of understand. I do understand what that means, but
so shift left. Just for the sake of, in case somebody is not familiar with the term, if you think about delivery pipeline, you have people. On the left side, let's say managers defining, product owners defining what we're going to do, developers writing code, testers writing tests, operators putting it somewhere and monitoring it in production, right? And I'm simplifying it greatly. Now, so kind of it goes from left to right. Now, shift left is the goal of moving the tasks of the people on the right side closer to the end of the process towards developers. So instead of me as operators waiting for you to tell me, deploy my application, and then I say, yes, I will do it right away. I give you means so that you can be in control to deploy your application, right? And I'm using application as an example. So shift left is about people who are traditionally on the right side of the process trying to create services to enable people on the left to be self-sufficient.
So could I say instead, Crossplane compositions allows you to simplify the developer experience?
Yes.
Okay.
Empower and kind of this is a long term, but kind of empower developers to do
it themselves.
To do it themselves, yes.
Awesome. All right, we have some more chat. Fuel Snail says, I don't know if bigger is better though, relating to Kubernetes.
Not always.
+1 question mark. Fuel Snail says, I've been very proud. I don't know any Kubernetes considering it is so big. It must be impressive in its own right. Yeah, but it's something we even talked a little bit about up top is how to start. But what were you going to say, Victor?
I think that there will be less over time. There will be less and less need for people to know Kubernetes, which probably sounds strange. But I think that we are going towards converting Kubernetes into something that just exists, like hypervisors. To run a virtual machine, you need a hypervisor. I bet that vast majority of people never deal with hypervisors anymore. I did in the early stages. But then the industry advances so far that it's just there. It's doing the job, and you need to think about other things. We'll get there. So you will be right, full snubble.
And then Grog DJ says, I like the idea of self-service for developers to do what they need to do without knowing all the details.
Yeah, that's the goal. Cool. One of the goals, yes.
And we have, once we have template 1, say, as creating a new base cluster entry, then can it be used to spawn child template like 1.1 or 1.2 for more specific changes from that original, tailoring another created subcluster function?
Yes, huge yes.
Huge yes. So we're talking about the compositions, making templates, and then those are templates for
compositions can spin compositions, which spin compositions, which spin something else. We can go into, I don't know if anybody saw the movie Inception, right? Dream within a dream within a dream, and kind of like, it can go very deep.
And then Bifrost says, as if we developers didn't have enough work, this got shifted more of it. Yeah, I mean, everyone's trying to make your experience better, I think.
I think that really, so some companies do it wrong and they kind of shift more and more work to developers. That's not my goal. My goal is actually to reduce the amount of work for developers and at the same time reduce the frustration created by dependency on others, right? Very often people are frustrated. Okay, I just finished this and now I cannot proceed because you have to do something else before, kind of that interdependency between different teams and expertise. I think that reducing that dependency, that friction, and everybody just consuming services from other teams ultimately simplifies things, does not make developers' lives more complicated.
And Cypheric says, hate to see cluster 1.1.1.1.1.
If you insist, you can do it.
All right, what else do we need to know about Crossplane, Victor?
Oh, I'm trying to think without diving into yet another hour and a half rabbit hole. Try it out. It's really awesome. And if you Google my name or YouTube my name, you will find actually a lot of resources, more practical examples of Crossplane.
And that's we have a question, but with the time I have left, I would love to have a concrete example of how you would use Crossplane with Argo CD, for example, or something a little more tangible than what we've talked about here, if that seems.
Yeah, I can improvise and I can show examples. Can I share my screen?
Oh,
no.
I guess.
Okay. Yeah, complicated, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let me describe it. So everything we do, so you can use Argo CD to manage anything that Kubernetes understands. Because ultimately what Argo CD does is it goes to Git repository, gets whatever is there, and tells Kubernetes, now run this, whatever that is. So as long as Kubernetes understands something, that something can be managed by Argo CD.
Okay.
And Crossplane extends what Kubernetes knows, what Kubernetes understands.
Okay.
So
got it.
And ultimately,
so is
the
Argo
example.
CD also a control loop, also watching your, or does it need to be triggered?
So think of it like 3 players here. Here I have let's say this side. You have a Git repository that contains the definitions of what you want, and then on the far right you have something real like AWS. Right? Now in the middle is your Kubernetes cluster. And in that Kubernetes cluster, you have first Argo CD that is making sure that whatever is in Git repository is synchronized with the cluster. And then you have Crossplane that is making sure that whatever reaches the cluster becomes reality somewhere else. Exactly. So you have AWS cluster or resource for anything AWS.
So this is like a Kubernetes management. It's like a management cluster.
Yeah, management cluster. Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
I'm
And I repeat just one more time, I'm using AWS only as example.
So is it common to have a management cluster with Crossplane? Or
and
it just depends on the scope of what
it's
you're
very
trying
common actually to have it with both Crossplane and Argo CD or Flux. I would say that vast majority of people or companies I know that are using Crossplane are using it with Argo CD or Flux. So if you let's say remove cluster from AWS, it's just AWS something, whatever that something is, right?
Okay, yeah.
So you define, and inside of that management cluster, there are 2 entities, Argo CD and Crossplane.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, Argo is making sure that what is in Git is defined, is synchronized into that management cluster.
Okay.
So whatever is there goes to the cluster, not the other way around.
Got
So
it.
it will
Not the
not.
other way.
I mean, there are ways for Argo
Ah,
CD to push back
that's
to Git, but edge cases.
Okay.
So you push something. So basically, you as a human, when I made you draw that person over there, actually that was wrong. You interact only by pushing things to Git. That's what you do. Argo makes sure that something is applied to the cluster, and Crossplane goes outside of the cluster and converts that into reality, right? Whatever that is, like database. Oh, you want the database? I need to go here and manage that database. So it would be an arrow from Crossplane to AWS resources, exactly.
Got you.
Yes.
So without Crossplane, Argo could, if it's like you're using this cluster to run applications, would be the more common use case. You would use Argo to keep that in sync with your Git
Argo
repo.
can only sync what is in Kubernetes clusters. Doesn't not know what to do outside it, right? And Crossplane knows how to speak with APIs of different SASes and vendors and providers and convert what Argo applied to the cluster into something else.
Excellent. So Crossplane is good for a GitOps style solution, but in combination with other tools, not necessarily standalone.
Yeah. I think that follows the principles and logic of, let's call it, Kube community or cloud native community, right? It's so vast that it would be almost a waste of time for us to reinvent the wheel. There are already solutions for XYZ. We are trying to create solutions for something else. And then we all interoperate and work together, like happy family.
We'll hold hands and sing a song. Okay, so now that we have this little drawing, let's talk about how drift detection works. Will you tell me about that?
Yeah, so in the context of Argo and Crossplane, Argo on one hand is constantly monitoring the Git repository and the resources in this case in the management cluster. It doesn't have to be, it can be any, but management in this case. And whenever there is a discrepancy between what I want, and what I want is what is in Git, and what it is, which in case of Argo is Kubernetes cluster, that is considered a drift. There is a difference between the two. And reconciliation is when that drift is solved, when they're made the same. So drift detection and reconciliation. And exactly the same is happening with Crossplane, except that Crossplane is not concerned about the drifts between Git and your management cluster. It is concerned between the drifts of, let me actually rephrase it. For Argo, the desired state is your Git, and the actual state is Kubernetes cluster. For Crossplane, Kubernetes resources are the desired state, and AWS in this example is the actual state. So depending on the actor, what is the desired and what is the actual state changes.
Okay. And so with Crossplane, you said with Argo, it's only pulling from Git repo. It's not pushing to Git repo. But with Crossplane, it's a control loop.
So AWS is also, so Arrow's a bit tricky, right? You can say it like that. But just to make sure, AWS is not pushing anything to Crossplane. So it is not modifying Crossplane. It has no right to do that. But yeah, Crossplane is, so think of it this way. Crossplane goes to API and says, okay, what is the state of this thing? Gets that information back, compares it with what the state should be, and then decides to act.
Okay. So Crossplane does drift detection between what's defined in your management cluster and then the actual resource that's outside of the. So if your AW resource was changed, what if someone went in through the UI and deleted a node? in your AWS cluster, what would Crossplane do?
Two things. First, if that person went to, let's say, Web UI and deleted it, first Crossplane will detect that and undo the change. What undoing means depends from the context. And second, that person should be fired. I'm kidding. Takeaway is only the first thing. But yeah, it doesn't matter if there is a drift. Doesn't matter how the drift happened, by accident, by a data center going down, by you clicking a button. Crossplane says, no, that's not what you told me that you want. You told me this, that's not what it is. I'm going to perform certain actions to remedy the situation.
Excellent. We have a question in chat. How many clusters can we create on base Kubernetes using Crossplane? Do we have minimums and maximums?
No real limitation I'm aware of. I mean, there is always limitation that, if you manage, if you have a management cluster that manages thousands of clusters, then you might need a bit more memory and CPU dedicated to the control plane of that management cluster, right? Because more things are being managed. But ignoring now potential increase in resource consumption, no limitation I'm aware of. There is always a limitation, but not that I'm aware of.
Excellent. Does anyone have any more questions from chat for Victor while we have his time and attention? I guess if not, you can jump over to the next stream. And Victor, do you feel like there's anything you want to tell about Crossplane that we didn't capture here?
Nah, I think we're good. I think my head already started spinning. I don't know how yours isn't. So no, I think that it's a good base. I think that we established a good base that kind of, that should potentially spark interest to kind of go deeper into the documentation.
Check it out. Fendel says, but I like it here. I like it here too. So based on just my experience doing this show, last time I did a show, which was 3 weeks ago, we talked about infrastructure as code. And a lot of the same people in the chat here were there last time. And they were really excited about Pulumi being able to be able to use their own programming language to talk about their own stuff. So I can see I'm actually a little surprised between Fendel and Fuelsnable that you didn't complain about YAML as much as I expected you to. But that is maybe a drawback that I see, or at least to the audience that I'm used to, the people I'm used to hanging out with in the stream. Adding YAML and complexity.
But my answer to that would be going back to the ecosystem story, right? Yes, Kubernetes understands YAML and JSON, right? That's a requirement of Kubernetes. Now, there is nothing preventing anybody, and actually it's very welcome, to say, hey, actually I prefer defining it as Helm templates, or I prefer using Pulumi, or I prefer using... So how you... a significant number of tools can actually generate Kubernetes resources.
Okay,
and
that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, you don't have to deal directly with YAML if that's not the thing. That's perfectly fine. Perfectly fine.
I like that answer a lot. So it seems like a lot of answers with Crossplane are like, but we have the whole Kubernetes ecosystem. Like whatever that is, you could do it with another tool in the ecosystem. Fendel Fuelsnable says, I don't complain about YAML. I'm known as the YAML apologist. And Fendel says that they were trying to be civil. Thank you, Fendel. YAML is the dark ones configuration format. We have some amazing shows and thank yous. And thanks, Victor. Great show as always. It was lovely to see you both in Barcelona last week. Thank you. And we do have a couple of questions, though, so we're not quite got off the hook. Can you talk about serverless on Crossplane?
So me and Mauricio, we actually submitted a talk for KubeCon that basically has that
exciting
title. Yes.
Yeah.
We are preparing. And if you're not going to KubeCon, that's perfectly fine, because we will almost certainly prepare that material in whether it will be a video or a post or something like that. So it's coming.
Excellent. So you're not going to answer now. You have to. We're going to be on a cliffhanger.
It's like Agatha Christie. I need to keep the suspense.
And then Kumar has a great question, which is, what should be the first provider that I try after this live stream? Something simple.
So whichever provider you choose, whichever provider you're normally using, whether that's AWS, Azure, Google, or whatever else, DigitalOcean. So try that one. It can come with a potentially huge amount of resources, but you ignore all those. Let's say if your poison is AWS, you say, okay, I installed a provider. It comes with 800 resources. Doesn't matter. I'm going to do something simple like, I don't know, create a S3 bucket, right? So just pick whichever resource in that provider, real physical provider, you're comfortable with, and if that proves to be too complicated, just find me on CSCF Slack or Kubernetes Slack or Google me. I'll give you a hand. It's a promise. I always give to everybody. I'll help out if you run into trouble.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Whitney. Wonderful session as always. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate your time. Grog is making nerd faces. And Fuel Sable says, I've been poisoned by AWS. Does that count? Fuel Sable. All right, I think that's a wrap, y'all. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. Thank you, Victor, for coming. Thank you, everyone who watches the recording. I appreciate you sharing your time with us. Have a wonderful day. Bye.
Thank you.